All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's not that many of us say I had problems sending out the reminder yesterday. Infinite Campus Messenger was being very glitchy. So I don't know if it actually went out because it was giving me fits, and I was trying to get Mr. Rosales to send it out for me, and he was having problems too. So I don't know if a reminder went out, but that's okay. No, we're small but mighty this morning. So what we're talking about this morning is part 2 of the book that we've been talking about. I felt that part 2 really, it's talking about the same themes that were covered in part 1, but it gets into like really the nitty gritty of like, what are some issues that your teenager may be facing, and like, how do we, be supportive of that when they're dealing with all of these issues. I'll be honest with this part. I liked a lot of it. There were certain parts that I felt the author got a little preachy. And I don't know if that was just the liberal Californian in me being like, I don't know if I'm with you on that one. Sure. So it's okay. That might just be me. But
it wasn't just you. So, I was like, am I thinking like a social worker and this is bothering me? Or is this like when we'll talk about it after, but like when he's talking about like mental health and like sometimes you just got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and you got to cope, and I'm like,
So that's okay. It's good when we're reading a book that we don't always agree with the author. So we have some questions. Do you want me to dive right into the questions, Yvonne?
Yeah, I mean, this part for me is really big because anxiety is the main focus of my work here. And I think a lot of people think of it as just like panic attacks. But when I think of anxiety, I think of like perfectionism, overachievers. I think of, just that constant worry about feeling inadequate and comparing yourself to others. And so it's so expansive. It's not just about like, oh, I feel stressed because I have too much homework. It's like the level of stress is so intense in a way that we've never experienced in our youth, most of us anyways. And so for me, this part is just like really big on like mental health and anxiety, and then healthy and unhealthy ways of coping with that. And so we could dive into the questions.
Yeah. Okay. Before we do that, I meant to say this in the beginning. I want to warn everybody, my mom is in the hospital. And so if all of a sudden my camera goes off and I mute myself, it's because I get a phone call. And so I just wanted to give everybody a warning on that. Hopefully that doesn't happen in this hour, but just in case, I wanted to.
I got you. Don't worry.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Let's dive into these questions. Let me find them. Hold on. Okay. So the first question, what do you think of the idea that few children escape anxiety? What do you think children are actually anxious about? And I have my own theories about this. And I think, Yvonne, we've talked about this before, and they allude to it. He alludes to it a little bit, but he doesn't really dive into it. And I don't think there's been enough studies about this generation of teenagers and what we have done to them in terms of schooling and school shooter drills, and just this perpetual fear of there being a school shooting. And it's a very real fear. I'm not dismissing that fear, and it wasn't something that I really realized as a problem. And I started teaching, just give you guys a little bit of background. I started teaching, my first year teaching was the year that Columbine happened. So like my entire, thank you, Jay. I know there wasn't a reminder. I had problems with Infinite Campus yesterday. Sorry. Yeah, I had problems with Infinite Campus sending out the reminder. Just so everybody knows, if ever that happens again, the link is always in my newsletter, which is on our website. It updates every week, and the link is always on the newsletter. So that you can always find it there. But yeah, there was problems with Infinite Campus, which is how I sent out the reminders yesterday, which is frustrating. Anyway, so I started teaching when Columbine happened. And so my entire teaching career has been, every year we do active shooter drills, and that's just the way it's been. I didn't really think about the fact that my own kids, their entire school career has had active shooter drills too. And it wasn't until my daughter was in high school and she was talking to me one day, and it was just such an offhand thing that she said, like, oh, whenever I get, like, in the beginning of the year when I have my new schedule, I always look at, like, okay, if there's a shooter, like, how would I escape in this classroom? And she's like, I always get worried that if I have a classroom that's on the outside of campus, then I'm more likely to get shot in this classroom. And I was floored that she just kind of like casually talks about this, that like this is something that she thinks about constantly. And I really truly believe deep in my heart that, and I don't know what the answer is, because I don't know if the answer is to get rid of these drills or, what we do about that, because this is still a thing. But this is perpetuating this like feeling of constant anxiety amongst our kids.
Yep. I sent a survey out a couple of years ago. It was probably 100 kids responded. It was basically like, how do you feel about that? Like, do they actually make you anxious? And I don't remember the exact percentages, but it was somewhere around 50-50 of like, yeah, I think about this often, or I'm worried about this happening. And I'm thinking about like just that like survivor brain versus learning brain, and how many of our kiddos are just in that constant state of worry. And how is that impacting their ability to learn? I mean, there's notifications on phones. They get like, oh, somebody said this, and maybe something's happening. There's even rumors. And then there's like legitimate concerns that come up. And it's like constantly worrying about your own personal safety while you're trying to focus in a class. Like, that's not something that I remember, So even just taking that poll, it was like, wow, it didn't really occur to me, just because I'm like on the outside, I'm the one like checking the doors and stuff. And it didn't really occur to me like what that feels like. I had this one instance where I was with the police officers and we were checking all the doors and windows. And I remember very distinctly peeking into one of the science buildings, and there's kids hiding behind the counter, like those little counters. And I saw like legitimate fear in their eyes. Like, it was scary for them, even just in that drill. And I was like, man. And then we're just like, okay, go back to class, go back to your learning. And it's like, anxiety is in everything that they do. I'm going to read like a little excerpt. It's basically like, they're anxious about terrorism, social welfare, the rise of student debt, climate change, the state of political discourse, anxious about school not being updated or their portals, or when they fail. They're anxious when they feel the mini seismic jolt of a notification on their phone buzzing in their pocket. They're anxious when alerts of another school shooting pop up on their phone while they're sitting in school. And this is just like a tiny glimpse of the things. That doesn't even go into like self-esteem and homework and worth and value and boyfriends and girlfriends and friendships and just all these different things. And I don't know if you remember this part, Jenny, but it talks about like, we assume that the kids who are performing better are under the most stress, right? But it talks about the kind of underachievers and that level of stress, of just the stress of being underachieving, like alone, is even more so. And so no kids are safe from the stress. You might have kiddos who are kind of disengaged, that are like, I don't really care. But I was just talking to a parent last night, and we were basically saying like, I've never met a kid who legitimately does not care. There's always something under that, So, for me, I agree with the statement of like, nobody's safe from it. Stress is a normal part of life, but to this extent is just like disheartening and scary.
Right. I in reading this book, I don't remember if I mentioned this last week. It's really convinced me, as like sitting in my seat as principal, that, and I've talked to my professional development team, and like collaboration and the work that we do with the teachers as we go into the next school year, is to really go with the assumption that every single one of our students has anxiety. That this isn't something that we just treat, with an SST or a 504 for certain students, but that we change our policies and procedures and just how we like deal with stuff as a school. And we just assume that every single student has anxiety. And it's a focus shift that I think is a really important focus shift. And I think it's a really important focus shift as parents, to not just assume our kids are okay, but to assume that they're anxious about something. And to try to get to like, what are they anxious about and how can we help them with that?
I hear a lot about, and I think I said this last week too, of people saying like, what could you possibly be anxious about? Because, I take care of everything and you just have to go to school. And it's like, I mean, just that small portion of the list that I read, it's just like so overwhelming. And anxiety can be something that, is so intense that they get diagnosed and they're having therapy. But for the general population, it's just that constant stress. And I don't know to what level everybody here has suffered from anxiety. It's such a spectrum, right? It's like the worry about being good enough and this, and then we have like the more extreme cases, right? Like like my case when I was in high school of like literally not being able to sit in a classroom. And when people think of anxiety, they think of it as being just so mental, but it's so physical. Like I would literally feel physically ill. I would feel like I was suffocating, choking, drowning, that I was going to die. Like I literally could not be in that space. And I have so many kids who present the same way. And so there are different levels of it. And some of it is like, yeah, we need to cope and practice these things. But then of course there's that level where they need some professional intervention. And I think one of our next questions is about like what we thought about mental health when we were growing up and how that's different now. Did we have that awareness?
Well, let's talk about a little bit of self-care first. Is self-care and dialogue about emotional well-being a conversation within your household? And how can we implement this? This is something I'm personally feeling very strongly right now. Those of you that were on in the beginning, I mentioned my mom is in the hospital right now, and I'm having to really like check myself and like, okay, am I taking care of myself? Am I, Yvonne, before everybody came in, she's like, are you getting enough sleep? Like, yes, I'm getting enough sleep. I'm still exercising. I'm taking time just to like take a deep breath. And, I'm one of the things I'm doing with self-care is I'm asking people to help. I'm asking people like, hey, I need you to do this for me. I need to cancel this meeting. I need to like, because I can't do everything right now. And I think that, we've talked, this is a topic that we talk about a lot, but this idea of self-care is something that is really, really important for us to model to our kids. And he talks about modeling, and our role as parents and modeling at the end of part 2. And I think that that's just really important, that when, you have our kids that are, one of the things that's causing their anxiety is they are overwhelmed with all of their commitments and all of their stresses, and teaching them that they can put something aside and that they can say, I can't do that right now. That's not good for me right now. And really putting their own mental health and their self first. That's such an important thing to do. And it's very difficult for us. I know personally, it's very difficult for me, especially with my kids. I can talk about how I'm feeling with my friends, and thank God I have wonderful friends. But it's hard for me to do that with my kids because I don't like, same thing that they don't want to burden me. I don't want to burden my kids with what's going on. Yeah. But I think it's really important to have that dialogue.
I just had this image, and this is like a total fake image in my head of me walking into my kiddo's room and being like, hey, what are you doing in there? Have you gotten enough time for yourself today? Like, it's always like, did you do your homework? Did you clean your room? And I had this replaying in my head all week when we talked last week about the emotional bank account. And I've really tried to give a lot of positives, but I'm thinking right now of like, that's one way that I can implement it in my house is to like poke in and check on them and their well-being, not just what they've accomplished or what they more likely have not accomplished, but really like, did you eat healthy today? Did you do this? Did you sleep? Did you spend any time talking to your friends? Like what, that kind of stuff. It's like, I think they would be shocked if I walked into their room. They'd probably like shudder, like, what am I getting yelled at for this time? And they'd be like, oh, am I okay? Like, it's going to be weird, but I think it's something that's so important because, I think the frequency with which we speak about things is an indicator of what's the most important to us. Right. And so when we think about what we talk about with our kids, it's probably school.
Yeah. And then one thing, and like it talked about in the book in this section and like the self-care is the importance of the time of like quiet and shutting off. And even if it's just like literally like 90 seconds. I have this little card on my desk. It's called Pause. And on the other side, I'm going to tell you what it says. I got this at some training I went to, and I keep it because I thought that it was just so valuable. So number 1, stop. Number 2, take 3 deep belly breaths. Number 3, check in. See what is here now, sensations, emotions, thoughts. Number 4, be curious about what you notice without making judgments. So this, what I love about this, and this is something that, you know, you can like share with your kids, is something they can do when they're feeling overwhelmed, is it takes 45 seconds to stop, breathe. Like you could do it in the middle of class, like when like stuff is like stressing them out, like, you know, in the middle of school, like this is something nobody's going to notice if you just like take 3 breaths and like really kind of stop and like focus in, how am I feeling right now? And I think that teaching our kids to take that time to like, okay, all right, I'm all right. And it's very simple, but it's so powerful.
Well, he talks about that idea of like sanctuary, like your home. I've always had this thought that like my bedroom is my sanctuary. I don't really watch TV in there. I usually read in there. It's where it's very like this calming space. When I enter that space, it's my time. It's where I wind down. And so that idea of sanctuary, I don't know about you, but I think of sanctuary as like, I just imagine this like beautiful like forest area where the sun's kind of coming through and it's still and it's quiet and the air feels good. And I just feel like safe and at peace and I don't have anything going on. Like that's kind of the visualization that I get when I think of sanctuary. And then I think about my home when I come home, the dogs are barking, my kid's making a smoothie, the blender's going, the dryer beeping is going off. I can hear somebody playing video games. Like there's no space for quiet. And so when you think about like what our kids endure, like all day they're being, you know, constantly in the space of somebody else. They go home, they're doing things, the TV's on for no reason. I don't know about you, but my TV just happens to always be on. I think my husband needs to get his hearing checked because he's a sound bar and no matter what he's watching, it's like distractingly full blast. And it's like, I feel like when I walk in sometimes that my shoulders are tense and I'm like, what am I feeling right now? It's like this weird angst. And it's like, oh, I just need a minute of calm. How often do we actually get that? And even more so for our kiddos, like they come home looking at imagine you're in your sanctuary and then somebody walks into your sanctuary and they're like, what are you doing? You left a mess in the kitchen and you're like, whoa, you're just like not really in that space. So how do we create that quiet moment, at least for 45 seconds in a day? And how do we encourage them to have that themselves? Because it really is grounding. It's like when you have that 45 seconds, it's almost like you feel like you can conquer another few hours, right? So creating that quiet space for yourself, first and foremost, and then for your family. Like, what can you do?
All right, let's talk about awareness and mental illness. So in your teen years, what was your level of awareness about mental illness? This generation has done great work towards eliminating stigmas about mental illness. And what stigmas do we still possess? This is time for me to be real honest about mistakes I've made in parenting. You know, he talks about in here, if your kid asks for therapy, get it for them. I am so guilty of not doing that. That my daughter said, Mom, I need to see a therapist. You know, I think I need to talk to somebody. And I was so like, oh my God, how am I going to afford that? I don't know what to do, you know, and I'm like, I can, you know, I'll help you. And like, let's just talk. And it wasn't enough. It was not enough. And it's absolutely a mistake I made as a parent that I wish I could go back in time and fix. I can't. We did eventually get her a therapist, but I delayed and I should not have. So I want all of you, I'm sharing this to like learn from my mistakes. Don't repeat my mistakes.
You're making me like kind of sick to my stomach thinking about it. Cause I think I shared a couple of weeks ago that my son, who's been suffering from depression for 3 years, finally said, Mom, I would be willing to talk to somebody. So I left a couple of messages with some therapists in the last couple of weeks, haven't heard back, and then just kind of like moved on. And when you said it right now, I'm like, oh, I just like literally put this huge note on my desk of like, kids don't ask for therapists frivolously. They just don't. There's really a rhyme or a reason or significance. And when they ask you that, it is so crucial. And thank you for that reminder. Cause I'm like, Oh my gosh, that's like number one on my to-do list today. Besides work, of course.
And it's hard as a parent because I'm not gonna lie, it's hard finding a therapist. It's not easy. There's resources out there. I think psychology.com, Psychology Magazine,
Yeah.
I think has like a good therapist finder where you can like put in, your zip code and like what you're looking for. There's like websites now and apps where you could do it online. But I'm not gonna lie, you guys, it's not easy finding a therapist.
This is a good opportunity for my plug, my Care Solace plug. For all of you that don't know, the district pays for a service called Care Solace. Basically what I do is I put in a referral for you. It's free of charge. Within 15 minutes, they call you, verify your insurance, and help you find a therapist in your network, accepting new clients, and we'll set up your first appointment. And that's huge because when your kiddo's struggling, you don't have a lot of time to be digging through the internet looking for a provider. That's not something that you have to do anymore. So reach out to me if that's something that you need, or if your kiddo has spoken to you about needing therapy. We have that service available to you. Care Solace plug.
Actually, what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to share my screen real quick because I want to show you guys something. I don't know if you are aware, parents. I know I send my weekly newsletter out, but just in case you can't find it, this is our website. This is the homepage. If you click right here where it says Principal's Weekly Newsletter. Sorry, it's a little bit slow today. So this is, where I've got my weekly newsletter. And again, this is where you can find the link for the weekly Zoom. If I ever can't send the reminder out, the link is here. But then also, if you keep scrolling, this is stuff that I just leave up there. I have the link for Care Solace.
Awesome.
So that's there for you. That is an amazing resource that this district provides to families.
Awesome.
Because I wish that had been around when I was looking for a therapist for Hannah, but it wasn't.
Absolutely. I don't know if you know this one, Jenny, but we just started something in our district that they're also paying for called Daybreak. And Daybreak is 12 sessions for every student in the district, regardless of insurance. This is something helpful for people who maybe have a private insurance company that doesn't have a lot of availability. It's something that they can use instead. Free of charge, 12 sessions. They're via Zoom. The kiddos can even do them at school in the wellness center. So just one more thing. The question you asked was about what we knew about mental health when we were younger in our teen years. And for me, I struggled so badly and I just assumed I was the only one struggling. And it took me years to figure out what I was struggling with. And one of the most powerful parts of like the healing process is identifying what it is that is going on with you. I just thought I was going crazy. I had no idea that I had anxiety or what that meant or that it was fixable. And so for me, it's so wonderful to see the kiddos, talk about therapy. We have a group of kids right now who just started a mental health and wellness podcast, and they talk about their own issues with mental health and trauma and stress and things like that. And so they're talking about it. They have so many subscribers too. It's wild. So it's like, it's something that people are interested in a way that back in my day, it was just not talked about. It was, I don't know if I had friends that were depressed. I must have, looking back.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about this generation of teenagers is they are erasing the stigma of, mental health and going to therapy. And I think that that's amazing. It is, you slowly see progress over time. And whereas they do all have anxiety, like they're not hiding it. They're aware of it and they're not wallowing in it. They want to get help, which I think is really, really great. So why don't we dive into, I lost my questions. Let's dive into some more specific issues. So let's talk about drugs a little bit. So if your child is abusing drugs, this is not an indication of the type of person they are. It's more of a sign of the degree to which they need help mitigating their anxiety, stress, and depression. Do you see drugs as an issue for your own child? Why or why not? This is where I'll share a little personal information about my failures as a parent. So when my daughter, she did get a therapist, her depression got worse. My daughter did attempt suicide. She was hospitalized. It was very, very difficult. And one of the things that they talked to me about, the doctors, was drug use. And I was like, oh, Hannah doesn't do drugs. She's an athlete. No, she doesn't do drugs. Yes, she did. Yeah, she was doing drugs all the time. And I had no idea. Me, who does like the presentations on vaping and like all this stuff, had no idea. So yeah. So parents, if you have no idea, it's okay. it's okay.
So common. And then when it's not, I'm not laughing because it's funny, but I'm laughing because the irony of it is like when parents do find out and then they come in and it's like super crisis mode, right? Like, oh my gosh, like react the way we react to what we find out is really important too. If you freak out, your kiddo's not going to tell you anything, right? If you normalize it, like, yeah, this is something teenagers do. I'm not naive to think that people only use drugs as a coping strategy. I mean, I'm sure they think it's fun and it's cool with their friends. I mean, there's some of that too. But thank you for sharing that, Jenny. That's like a hard thing to say as a parent of like, dang.
I want to like really like a lot of the reasons I like these weekly parent meetings are so important is because I want to share like what we went through, and because we've come out the other side, and I'm not going to lie to you. Oh my God, it was so hard. And it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was the worst time of my life. It was so hard. But like now we're like coming through this, and because I was behind in my reading. And so I was supervising the girls' basketball game last night and finishing my reading. And I was reading this part about drugs. And there's one line in here that he talks about, like, if your child's out walking the dog. And I took a picture of that paragraph. And I'm like, Hannah, every time you walk the dog, were you doing drugs? And she just started laughing at me. It was just, I'm like,
what did she say? She didn't say.
She's like, no, I wasn't doing it then.
Now all the poor dogs in our school are not going to go out, right? Like, dang, well, my kid has not walked the dog yet, but I know he certainly has used drugs. So
my other favorite part about in the book was where he talks about, don't call it marijuana, call it weed. Because my husband is so guilty of that. My husband, because he's, bless his heart, he's very, very nerdy, and he'll like marijuana, and we tease him about that a lot. And so that made me laugh out loud.
It feels like every time I pick up a word that I think is cool, I'm like a year behind anyway. So I just stopped trying.
So one thing I did want to bring up in this, and like what we see here at Piedmont, like, because he talks a lot about alcohol in the book, and that, kids, like you basically should assume that your kids are drinking. I'm going to disagree with him on that. And I don't know. And I was texting with Yvonne, like, is it because we're in California? Are things different? I don't actually know where Dr. Duffy lives. But in my experience with dealing with high school, I think weed and pot is much more prevalent than alcohol.
I think alcohol, from what I hear from students, is a weekend thing, getting together with your friends, finding a bottle of something. It's not something that like they're like drinking out of flasks like in the movies in the bathroom. They're vaping in the bathroom.
We rarely catch kids with alcohol on campus. It is rare.
Yeah. I haven't heard that in years.
Like, are they vaping in the bathroom? Yes, they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happening at every single high school. And probably middle schools across the country. It is a huge problem. And he alludes to it. I'm feeling like this book, it's a couple of years old. I feel like this has become much more of a problem, like since, he talks about it like, well, pot's being legalized, in many states. And it's really easy for kids to get. It is really and it's really easy once they turn 18, it is really easy for them to get a marijuana card. Because my daughter has one. As soon as she turned 18, she got one. And because they all have anxiety, that's all they need to say in order to get one. So even though it's legal and you have to be 21, they can get a pot card and then they can get it shipped to their house. It's so easy.
It's like such a slippery slope though with drugs, because it's like, I can understand that the feelings are beneficial for somebody who's super anxious. But on the flip side, I've also seen students who are like, I only smoke when I'm really, nervous or whatever. And then it's like, I'll have a lot of them who are like, I don't really function well or feel comfortable in the world at all if I'm not high. And it's like, that's a problem, right? Or I'm like not motivated anymore because I just have to be like high to like be able to function. And so then a lot of the care that should be happening gets put off because they have this temporary coping strategy.
This was the part where I really kind of disagreed. I felt like he got a little preachy. And I don't necessarily agree that if your child is doing drugs or drinking, it's the end of the world. I think that it's really important for parents to talk about that.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really important for parents not to overreact. Yeah. If you do catch your kid, smoking pot, or you do catch them drinking, to not overreact. And he did have this really great part in there where he talks about like pausing and not immediately reacting. And even if it's 5 minutes, like go out, take a quick walk, do that breathing, like do something so that you don't react in anger right away, because you can't take that back. And that's where that, emotional bank account becomes really important. Like you want to take a step back and like come at this calmly.
Your initial reaction is a really great indicator of how the follow-up will be with your kiddo. You freak out and they freak out. And then that line of communication is broken, whether it's talking about drugs or sex or whatever, all the issues that we're going to be covering today. Just take that moment and just breathe. Because I know we've all, or will all hear something that our kiddos tell us that is not something that we had hoped for our own kids.
All right. Yvonne, do you want to talk about video games or do you want to talk about sex?
Well, what's more relevant? It depends on your kiddo. I think they're both pretty relevant. I'm not sure I have anything super insightful to share on video games. I did highlight some things in the book. My kid's a gamer. He spends a lot of time there. He talks a little bit about like, the level or the amount of screen time that you spend every day is, can be connected to levels of depression and things like that. We've talked about gaming a lot as far as like it being a social outlet, being something where kids are working together for a common goal, even if that goal is to like kill things on the screen, and having that kind of community in that way. He does talk about some of the upsides, talks about, capping time limits for your kiddos. But he says stuff about like, we are naturally inclined to stop the gaming, but it's like, how do we come alongside of them to support the healthy aspects about it, but also help them learn about moderation, right? Anything in moderation. I don't like that he really compared gaming to like juuling and vaping and all those other unhealthy strategies, because I don't think it's in the same category. It is addictive, and they talk about putting it in the next DSM as like a diagnosis of like gaming addiction. I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm not really totally in agreement with the fact that he put it in like that. He says it, what did he say? He said something to that effect of like, just like vaping and all these bad things. I don't feel that way. I feel like there's more benefits. Like I don't have any Juul benefits for my kid, right? Like nothing good comes out of it.
I totally agree with you. And because I have a child who's a gamer also, and he's always been, so I can't say that, he started gaming and he became socially awkward. He always has been since he was 2 and in preschool. Like he's always been awkward and not really comfortable around his peers and not quick to make friends. Like that's the way my son's always been. And so I see, when he's playing Fortnite and playing these games, it's an outlet for him. And it is a way to socialize for him that he feels comfortable in. And it's something that he frequently like will talk to us about, like, hey, I did this and like, I'm so excited. The next level's coming out and blah, 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 blah. I have no idea what he's talking about, but he is super excited about it. It's something that he's really passionate about. And then he because my son spends a lot of time drawing, he's an incredible artist, but he draws like characters from video games and like things like that. And like, he loves it. And it's the one thing that he like in his life that he is like super excited about. I mean, if he were super excited about playing baseball, I don't think I would, like take that away. It wouldn't even occur to me to take that away from him.
I'm trying to think of like hobbies I had. I used to love to cross stitch. It was a really nerdy thing to do when I was like in 6th grade. But like thinking back of it, it's like somebody could say that's a huge waste of time, right? But for me in that moment, it was like something that I enjoyed to do, and it just helped me relax. I wasn't trying to become like a professional cross stitcher or anything like that.
Right.
I just enjoyed it. And so I think it's kind of unfair for us to like think about their hobby as something that, oh gosh, what if they do that their whole life or whatever? Like a hobby can just be a hobby. And the upside of this is that there is companionship associated with it. Again, moderation, right? Whatever that hobby is, it's like you don't really have the capacity to do that all day, every day. Anything we do, right? So I think it is kind of unfair to say like, oh, that's horrible, or it's just as bad as smoking. It's like, no, maybe it's not significant to me, but it is something that he enjoys. And how do we help him moderate what he's doing and to what extent he's doing it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, we have rules like he knows, like, okay, we tell him, because we do have to be like, it is now homework time, because my son is not self-motivated to just be like, oh, I have to do my homework now. That's not going to happen. But he does know that when we're like, it is time to do homework, he's like, okay, I have to do homework now. Yeah. Like, he doesn't fight us on that. And so I consider that a win, okay, so let's talk about sex. And this is something I think we're going to touch on it a little bit today, but I think this is probably something in the next couple of months that we'll spend like a full meeting on, because it is a really important topic. So have you had the talk? What are your rules and expectations around dating? Have you shared these with your children?
A lot of questions. Sorry.
We made assumptions about how our teens think and feel about sex. So let me just, I think in my own case with my own kids, I have handled one of my children with sex pretty well and not very well with my other child. So my daughter, and I think, I don't know if it's because it was my daughter, it was easier for me to talk about sex with my daughter. It was not easy, but it was one of the things that growing up, my mom never talked to me about sex. And and the things that she would say to me were very like anti-sex, and you better not be having it. Like those were the conversations I had with my mom. So things that she said to me, like, let me know I cannot ever talk to my mom about this. She is not somebody I can go to. And so that was my experience growing up. And I never wanted my daughter to feel the same way. And so I always, ever since, she started going through puberty, I was like, always talk to me about this stuff. You can come to me anytime, totally open to it. I'm not going to judge you. Talk to me about anything. And so, and she did. And she's like, Mom, I need to talk to you about sex. And I was like, oh boy. And it was uncomfortable, where, and it wasn't just, because your kids are going to ask you, if you have this open dialogue, and I really do recommend you do, they will ask you, when was the first time you had sex? And you got to be like, ooh, okay, I'm ready to have that conversation. It is not, but he talks about in here, what I really did like is he talks about, it's uncomfortable for you as your parent. The child's probably not uncomfortable. This is a me problem and my uncomfortableness with it. Mm-hmm. But we got through it, and it was really good. And we had several, we still have conversations, they're really good conversations. Yeah. And she feels like she can come to me for advice, and I really cherish that. At the same time, I have never had a conversation with my son about sex. And he's a couple of months away from turning 13. I really should. I keep expecting my husband's going to do that, but he's got his own issues and I don't think he is. So I need to like get over myself and probably talk to my son about sex, because I think, and he talks about it, like, I think especially with our boys, having conversations about sex and how you treat people around issues of sex is really, really important. And those conversations about consent, those are really important conversations to have. And we can't just assume that they're picking it up somewhere. So Yvonne, you have 3 boys. Have you talked to about sex with them?
You know, what's funny is that like my husband always has told me like, gosh, I mean, you know me, I have no filter and I just like say whatever. So sex has been like a very normal part of conversation in my house from me to the kids, talking about consent. I never like officially had like a sit down until the beginning of this school year. And I know I've shared this with the parents before, is my kid went off to college and got horribly drunk and threw up all over the dorm and called mommy to come and help him clean it up. And so when I got there, there's 8 boys all living in a dorm. And I don't know what came over me, but I sat them all on the couch, like in full mom social worker style. And we talked about alcohol and consent and what that means. And I think I initiated because one of the boys said, oh, when your son was drunk, this girl was kissing him, trying to kiss him. And we locked him in the room because we didn't want him to do something stupid. And I was so glad that they did that and horrified as a mother. I like literally went in my car and cried afterwards, but I had to be like, really. So it was like this full conversation about it, something that I probably should have said a long time ago. But you just like, as a parent, sometimes you just assume there's no need. Never assume there's no need. There will be a need at some point. So I've really normalized sex. We talk a lot about like the no's about sex, like don't do this, don't do that, make sure. But we don't really talk about like what it is. There's going to be a natural curiosity for children to learn about, experiment with sex. And I didn't know that my kiddos were at the level that they were until I went through one of my kiddos' phones and his group chat, they were all sending each other anime porn, which is very awful and graphic. And then it was like, well, I guess I didn't know it was time to talk about pornography, but look, here we are. And so we did. And, you know, when you think about pornography in teenagers, it's like what they see becomes what they envision sex to be. And a lot of times it's violent. It's not reality. It's not, you know, these things. And so I'm like, how did my life go from just like cooking dinner, baking cookies with them to talking about anime porn? Like, how did this happen? It just happened so fast. And so, you know, my kiddo, my youngest is 13 now. And it's like, I don't know when I should have started talking about it. You know, I think in the book, people say like, oh, wait till after they're 13. By 13, it's too late. I had a peer tell me about sex when I was in kindergarten. And I don't even remember the details of it. I remember the conversation, but I'm sure I was misinformed in a lot of ways. So assume that somebody's already talking to your kid about it or they're learning about it on their own. My dad gives me a hard time. Why do you talk like that about your kids? My mom never talked to me about sex. And I'm like, yeah. And what happened? So it's uncomfortable, but it's so necessary. And, you know, my husband's slightly awkward. And so he's probably watching this. He can be slightly awkward. So my kids actually beg me, like, if we're going to do that awkward talk thing, can it be with you? And that made me feel good. So that's kind of what, let's see, what is this?
Yeah. So like I said, February, like we're gonna, I'll probably, I gotta schedule, let's do it sometime in March. We'll have a whole full conversation about how to talk about sex with your kids, because it is really, really important.
Yeah.
And you know, Yvonne, you mentioned pornography, and he talks about pornography in the book, and I think you just have to assume, because it's so prevalent and the internet is like such a thing. Like when we were kids, it was kind of hard to get, right?
And go down to the dirty bookstore.
Right. You know, I think when I was a kid, they had like the 1-800, what was it, the 997? what was it? Like the phone numbers you could call. So it's not, but now it's everywhere. And don't just assume that it's boys with pornography. And that was a mistake I made. I never talked to my daughter about pornography. I don't even know if we've still actually had a real conversation about pornography. But then she made this offhand comment to me not too long ago that her best friend, who is a girl, like was fully addicted to porn. And I was like, oh, like blew me away. So don't just assume that it's boys.
We put a lot of emphasis on what the boys think and what the boys do and listening. Really quickly about sex, the last question in here is like when we make assumptions about how our teens think about it, we assume like, oh, our this population is over sexualized and they don't know what it means to be committed and all these things. At their heart of hearts, kids I talk to, they want to be in a monogamous, committed relationship with somebody that loves them and cherishes them and cares about them. And I think the narrative that is going around is that that's not true because it's so accessible to them. But really in their heart of hearts, they're still like the person that wants to be loved and have something special. So we shouldn't assume that that's what it is. But we also have to be aware that like, yeah, there is parts of being a teenager that are over sexualized, and, you know, the internet is just like a whole another beast. But, you know, we will talk about how to talk about sex. I was kind of like you, Jenny. I was raised though in a really religious household where it was like, you're abstinent or you're going to hell. Like that was literally what the message was. So we didn't talk about safe sex or anything. And so I appreciate the openness and the freedom to be able to speak about these things with my kids. It's not my favorite part of mothering though.
No, it's not an easy conversation. So let's touch on, and again, this is something that we're just going to touch on and that we will come back to this. This is a topic that we had already planned to do. But let's briefly talk about suicide. Like I said, this part of the book, it just definitely talks about some heavy topics. And this is, you know, like I said, my daughter had attempted suicide. This is very personal to me. So the rates of suicide are alarming, but perpetual suicidal ideation is at an all-time high. Have you talked to your children about suicide or suicidal thoughts? Is this something that impacted your life either directly or indirectly? And so this was something that I had not talked to my daughter about suicide. I hadn't, even when I knew she was suffering from depression, I didn't talk to her about suicide until, like, thank God she wasn't successful, and thank God we got help. But I think it's really important that you talk to your kids no matter what about this. And like I said, this is a topic that we'll circle back around and we'll spend an entire meeting on, about how you have this conversation. One thing, you know, that and it was kind of like just like one sentence, you know, of how helpful safety plans are, that when we had a really good safety plan, it was so amazingly helpful for me and my husband to check in with my daughter. And we had the system, it was like a stoplight, like green, yellow, red. And just to kind of like every day, like checking in on her mood, like, where are you at? Are you green? Are you yellow? One day she was having a real, like, she got into an argument with, my husband is her technically her stepfather. So she got into an argument with her biological father, and she sends me this text message, like just red. And I like run down there and I'm like, all right, let's talk about this, because like, it's just like, she didn't have to, like, we like had this like code where we didn't have to, like,
I love that.
We knew, like, okay, where are you at? What do we need to do? And we had like, okay, if she's yellow, this is what, like, my husband and I needed to do to support her. And it was so helpful.
Love that. I love that. Right now, Kayla and I have probably done more risk assessments in the last 2 weeks than we've done all year. I don't know what that's stemming from necessarily. And a risk assessment is basically like a full on like suicide assessment. I have a lot of kids who perpetually think about suicide. I differentiate between like passive and active suicidal thoughts. A passive thought would be when a teenager's like, gosh, I wish I didn't wake up in the morning, or I wish I got in a car accident and didn't survive it. Where an active thought would be like they have a plan to commit suicide, and we've had a lot of just like those passive thoughts of just like, I don't know how to get out of this situation. I have my own experience with my kids and suicidality. I had one who had really bad anxiety and, you know, just would just beg to not be alive for a significant amount of time before we got him help. And so it's real. It wasn't something that I just thought naturally to bring up with my family. My oldest, who I was talking about getting therapy, finally, I was kind of like just kind of going through the motions like I do of like, oh, okay, I'm like, he's like, I've been depressed for 3 years. I'm like, oh, okay, any suicidal thoughts? He's like, duh, every day. And I like paused. I was like, oh, like, I don't know why I didn't ask you that sooner. And I don't know why I'm shocked by that. It's your own kid, right? And I think when you feel so hopeless, I don't know if anyone here has ever experienced like suicidal thoughts, but it's like the pain of depression or even anxiety is so deep that the alternative feels like a breath of fresh air to like stop that pain. And so it's so important to talk about, because it would be really scary for a teenager who's never talked to their parent about mental health to be like, hey, I've been feeling this way and it's scaring me. Because most of the time they don't want that, they don't want to do that, but the thought will come up. And sometimes that's an anxiety response of like, this thought keeps coming in their mind, like, oh my gosh, what if I accidentally do it? And so just to normalize in conversation of like, part of being a teenager and having depression might be suicidal thoughts. And that's something that you are open to talk with me about at any point. Just putting that out there, I think would surprise a lot of people as to how many kiddos would be like, yeah, I have thought about that. It's a scary question to ask. You know, and there's this fear that like, if we talk about it, we're putting those thoughts in their head. Maybe they never thought about suicide and now I'm giving them these thoughts. It's like, it doesn't work like that. Like, they're already there. And if they're not, you talking about suicide isn't going to cause them to think about or attempt suicide. Like, that's not how it works. So just knowing that that's normalizing those thoughts is something that I think we should all do, just in case they ever want to talk about it. They know that there's an open door.
Yeah. And so I know that we didn't dive deep into that. And like I said, this is something that we're going to come back around. So next week, we're going to finish the book. And then we have a week off because that's our February break. When we come back, I think we have suicide scheduled for that week that we come back. I got to double check. But these are topics, as I know these are heavy topics, and like we should, you know, really dive into like, how do you have these conversations with your kids? They are really, really important to have, and they're really scary to have as a parent. Believe me, I've lived through this. It's not fun.
I know, it makes looking back to like parenting a kid with colic feel good. Like,
like those were easy days. So yeah, this is just, but I think I really truly believe that, like, you know, these teenage years can be so difficult, and like raising a teenager, God, man, it's so hard. But the more work you do now and like really like dig into this, like you are prepping them so that they can go out into the world and be adults. Because I know, Yvonne, you hear so many stories of like kids that go off to college and they're in their 20s and they just can't like cope. You know, and like in this section, he talks about, you know, this client that like he had started, like had met as a teenager and then like stopped therapy and came back. And this guy had spent his like a whole 20s like in his parents' basement and like just had not, like that's all of our fear, right? Like, we don't want that to happen to our kids. So,
oh my gosh.
Like doing the work now so that they could go out and be successful adults. Like this is the time that we do it. And someone's having really hard conversations.
Yes. Everybody take a deep breath. That's a lot of stuff.
I know. So part 3 is filling your toolbox. And it's much shorter. Part 2 is actually pretty long. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. And that will finish up the book. So thank you guys for joining us today. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week and weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.